Hello, everyone. Today we're going to talk about one of the most common questions that I get. It's probably one of the most common questions that any biblical vegan gets is that, well, didn't Jesus eat fish? And people will use this as a dispute to say that the Bible is not a vegan book. And which I might, if you're going to get down to it and all the technicalities, no, the Bible that we have today, the final product of the history that was rewritten and given to us, it's not so much a vegan book, but the story and what God intended was meant to be a vegan book, or at least a vegetarian book or story. And Jesus, he was at least vegetarian. And this might be something that I need to clarify because there are a few people who say, well, you always use that word vegan. And there are clear examples where, milk or something is mentioned, or honey, or things like that. So I use the word vegan for the sake of argument. It's just kind of a general term. I will try to clarify or specify when I'm talking about someone being a vegetarian from now on, just to appease those who want to focus on some of those minor things those minor points of clarification. Jesus was at least a vegetarian. We're going to look at that. And the fish stories, excuse me, the fish stories are probably the biggest example. I know the Passover lamb is another one, but that'll be in the next video. So for this one, we're going to focus on what Jesus did do with fish. Did he handle the fish? Did he eat fish? And there are three examples or three stories in the Bible where this needs clarification. One is when he fed the 5,000 or the 4,000. Another one is when he's on the shore with the disciples. And he says, cast your nets on the other side. And then they brought the fish and they did eat. And the third example is when he was resurrected and they gave him fish and honeycomb. So those are the three examples that we're going to look at today. And I will start with a passage here. Let me pull this up. Let me get rid of this. Okay. John 6, verse 12 through 14. I can pull it up. And if you can see from the screen, it says, this section in my book is titled Ichthus, because that is, there's a history behind that and why that word is used. When they were filled, he said to his disciples, gather up the fragments that remain, that nothing is lost. Therefore, they gathered them together and filled the baskets with the fragments of the 5 barley loaves. That's the first thing to notice, is that the bread is always emphasized in these stories, and the fish not so much. You can tell that the fish were added to the gospel texts that are in the canon. Okay, and but even then, you can still see the truth. If they were a part of the story, we're going to look at these texts, and if they were originally a part of this story, you can see that Jesus never did handle the fish, or he didn't bless the fish. Okay. Everything that remained and over and above unto them that they had eaten. Then those men, when they had seen the miracle that Jesus did, said, this is of a truth that prophet that should come into the world. All right, so there's part of the story according to John, and that's one. Like I said, this is one of the common arguments. Feeding of the multitudes should prove that Jesus endorsed eating animal flesh. Okay. Like I said, when you take a closer look at these, his focus was on blessing and breaking the bread only. Okay. And the fish was left out of that miracle. the feeding of the 5,000, that's in all 4 Gospels. And the feeding of the 4,000 is in 2 Gospels, okay? And in each record, you're going to find that the writer is careful to describe how Yeshua handled the bread, but not the fish. Okay, so even if this is an authentic piece of literature, these 4 Gospels, and the writers did witness fish as a part of the story, which we're going to go with that. My book is written in a way that gives the text the benefit of the doubt, and the writers did witness fish as a part of this story. But even then, they were careful enough to describe that he did not touch the fish. So, and it'll come as a surprise to a lot of people to learn this, because, you know, when we grow up in Sunday school and we learn about this story, we just picture him breaking the fish, okay, which we're going to talk about. That doesn't make sense either. We know that he was provided with 5 loaves and 2 fishes, okay, but he only blessed the bread, according to the text, but he only blessed the bread, okay? According to the text, 5 loaves, 2 fishes, and he only blesses the bread. And I want to thank, now I don't even remember his name. I read his book, Ryan Hicks. He is the one who pointed this out. I don't know if it's something that he observed himself, but he wrote it in his book, and noticed how all of these stories do omit fish in certain parts. And there's a good reason why. And one thing that he says in his book is that it's worth noting that in Judaism, there is no blessing for animal flesh, because it was justly seen as the product of violence. There are several blessings for foods originating from God, such as a blessing for bread, juice from grapes, a blessing for the 5 grains, a blessing for vegetables, and a blessing for fruits, but no Jewish blessing for animal flesh. The type of blessing Jesus likely pronounces over the bread would have been the hamatzi. Okay? So, and this is the difference between what is commonly taught in the churches and what the Gospels actually teach. Okay? The writer describes how Yeshua ignored the supply of fish. Okay? It shows that he neglected that part of what was given to him, and he fed the multitude with vegan options. Okay? Vegan options. It shows that he did only distribute the bread among the disciples. With the opening verse that I read, it showed them collecting the leftovers, and only the bread was mentioned. That was in John. Okay? And here I will pull these bullet points up and show you the references where it talks about handling the loaves only. And looking up to heaven, he blessed and brake and gave the loaves to his disciples, and the disciples to the multitude. And then here, and that's in Matthew 14:19. Here it says, how many loaves do you have? Again, the emphasis is on the loaves. And that's in Mark 6:38. And just a verse prior, he says, the disciples were asking him, should we go and buy 200 penny worth of bread and give it to them to eat? And then a few verses later, in verse 44, it says, and they that did eat the loaves were about 5,000 men. So it's always talking about loaves, but not fish, when it actually talks about what was given to them. Okay? Therefore they gathered them together and filled the 12 baskets with the fragments of the 5 barley loaves, which remained over and above unto them that had eaten. All right? So there it is. Those are some examples of what the text actually says. And I think it's interesting that even when it talked about them going, they calculated the cost of buying bread, but nothing was mentioned about fish or any other animal product. And despite that Yeshua was offered the bread and the fish in these versions of the gospel, according to these accounts, the text is clear that only the bread was utilized while the fish was just caught in the mix, so to speak. And that's the only reason the fish was mentioned, along with the bread, because it was right there in front of everyone. So if it seems like the fish was blessed in either account, it can only be because it is what was present or presented to him. It was just part of the story, and that's all. That's as far as it goes. The fish was just part of the story, but it's not what he utilized to feed the 5,000. Okay. And I know there are a lot of skeptics out there, and they'll argue that some of the text does describe breaking the meat. And so if you read that he broke the meat, you can't use that either, because meat is a generic term used for food. It doesn't mean animal flesh. When you read the word meat in the Bible, it is not in reference to what people today know as meat. This has been another big point of confusion for modern Bible believers who read about meat in the Bible, and it's only talking about food. And more times than not, it's talking about bread or fruit. Okay? Like I said here, the occasions where meat refers to animal flesh is minimal compared to the occasions where it's used to describe food in general, such as bread. And the only item that was broken and passed out was the bread. And one thing I asked in the book is, after all, how do you break a fish? It doesn't make sense. The text says he broke the meat and handed it out. And people think, oh, he's talking about the fish. Well, how do you break a fish? If you're a fisherman, then you know that a fish must be cut and cleaned with a knife. It takes time to do this, okay? And then cooked before it's suitable to eat. And none of these steps were described throughout the entire narrative of the Gospels, okay? So, and I know a lot of people imagine a fish basket from Captain D's or Long John Silver's, but, that's hardly the case. I mean, we're dealing with a people who handed him bread and 2 fishes. It said they handed him 2 fishes. All right. So, and nothing was described as cleaning the fish, nothing like that. And I don't know, people assume, and my whole life I assumed, oh, he just broke the fishes and handed them out and multiplied that. No, he broke the bread only. And the account of the 4,000, it's no different. The same details are in that event. And later in the Gospels, in Matthew, namely, Yeshua, he recapped on both events, the feeding of the 5,000 and the 4,000. And here's what he says when he's telling his men, his hearers, the people, he shows them which items were mentioned and which items were not. It says here in Matthew 16, verses 8 through 11, which when Jesus perceived, he said unto them, O ye of little faith, why reason ye among yourselves, because you've brought no bread? Do you not yet understand, or do you not remember the 5 loaves of the 5,000 and how many baskets you took up? Neither the 7 loaves of the 4,000 and how many baskets you took up? How is that you don't understand that I spake it not to you concerning bread, that you should be beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees? Wow, that's pretty big. He doesn't mention anything about the fish because he didn't handle the fish. He doesn't remember the fish as being part of the story. Okay? And the evidence is present within the Gospels, within what we have in canon. And I haven't even gotten to the other Gospels yet that are outside and beyond the Bible, the extra biblical Gospels. Okay. Jesus did not handle directly or offer fish to the multitudes. And this is according to the gospel accounts in the Bible. Remember that. What I've just presented to you is from the canon. Okay? But here we can look at, this is the Gospel of the Holy 12. Now we're going to go look to see what is said here. Okay? It says, and Jesus, when he came forth, he saw much people and was moved with compassion towards them, because they were as sheep having not a shepherd. And the day was far spent, and his disciples came unto him and said, this is a desert place, and now the time is far past. Send them away that they may go into the country round about, into the villages, and buy themselves bread, for they have nothing to eat. He answered, and he said unto them, give ye them to eat. And they said unto him, shall we go and buy 200 pennyworth of bread and give them to eat? See, this lines up with the story from the Gospels, in the canonical Gospels. Should we go into town, buy 200 penny, even down to the penny, guys, and give them to eat? He said unto them, how many loaves do you have? Go and see. And when they knew, they said, 6 loaves and 7 clusters of grapes. Well, how about that? And he commanded them to make all sit down by companies of 50 upon the grass. And they sat down in ranks by hundreds and by 50s. And when he had taken the 6 loaves and the 7 clusters of grapes, he looked up to heaven and blessed and brake the loaves and the grapes, and also gave them to his disciples to set before them, and they divided them among all. And they did all eat and were filled, and they took up 12 baskets full of fragments that were left. Again, the leftovers was bread. And they that did eat of the loaves and of the fruit were about 5,000 men, women, children. And he taught them many things. That's huge, guys. And it puts a new twist on the entire narrative. And the further you investigate, the more relevant this side of the story becomes. It's more in line with design, creation. It reflects a Messiah who lived according to what our Creator intended when he made us. And since most people contend that the New Testament Gospels depict Yeshua eating fish, we're going to look at that now too, okay? Did he eat? Okay, and we just saw that he didn't handle fish, but now people think he ate fish. So let's look at the occasions where this behavior is seen. And like everyone else, guys, I assumed this settled the matter at first. But there are more possibilities for interpretation. In John's Gospel, for instance, it doesn't give an account of Jesus eating fish until we get to the last chapter. This is one thing. I'm not saying this is how it is, but it is possible that John 21, the last chapter, was an added part of the text. And there are places in the Bible where the text seems to complete a thought or wrap up a story or something, but then suddenly it goes on to introduce a new thought. And that's the case with John chapter 21. It's often debated. People debate this, whether or not it was an original part of the manuscript. And you'll just find this. You'll find one passage in a certain version of the Bible that doesn't appear in another version, or even entire chapters that are missing or added to versions of the Gospels. And people are okay with that. But when we get on the subject of veganism, oh, no, that's not a possibility. But what to look for is whether the text belongs. You got to consider whether it's disruptive to the context. And that's the whole debate about John chapter 21. It's evident that that Jesus, he called some of the disciples to abandon their former trade of fishing. Okay, it says, no, quit fishing. I'm gonna make you fishers of men. But in John chapter 21, after their entire ministry and everything that transpired over the past 3 years, 3.5 years, they went to go back to their former lifestyle and what they were doing before Jesus had called them away from that. So a lot of people consider that to be a red flag, and I think that's definitely worth considering. Why would they go back to something he called them away from? So you got to scratch your heads. Why did they go back to fishing if he pulled them from that lifestyle? And it only makes sense if you ignore the storyline that we're talking about. The whole Messiah who was vegan, who taught against animal sacrifice, who taught that animals' lives were precious. Okay, this is the Messiah who came, who wanted us to get back to priesthood and stewardship of creation. And so the disciples fishing after the ministry of Yeshua, it only makes sense if, and I'm not saying John chapter 21 is all a lie, it's all completely fabricated, but the details at least have been skewed, okay? That's where we got to understand the life of Yeshua, who submitted to God's expectation. So if a given text depicts a different Messiah than one who submitted to our Creator's original Torah and instruction of the garden, then we have to question the text. If it doesn't line up with a life-giving Creator and someone who expected good stewards over creation, I would rather question the text than question God, who would be going against his moral, or a Messiah who's going against a life-giving Creator's moral standards. Okay? Notice how John in chapter 20 seems to conclude his gospel. Okay? We will take a look at this, and it says in verse 30 and 31, many other signs truly did Jesus in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book, but these are written that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you might have life through his name. Okay, that sounds like a wonderful way to wrap up a testament, a gospel about the life of Yeshua. He did many other signs that are not written here. It's like he's concluding. He's like, I've written so many things, and he did many other things that I didn't get a chance to write about. But these are written. What I've just concluded was written that you might believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of the God, and you might have life through his name. And that, to me, does sound like a conclusion of his gospel. And back in the early days, one of the most practical methods of falsifying a text was to add information at the end of a scroll, because it is not possible to squeeze a lot of information anywhere else. It's not like Microsoft Word, where we have the luxury of cleaning up an article, adding an entire paragraph between two other paragraphs. The scribes had to rely on enough space at the bottom of the scroll. And I think it's possible to add John chapter 21 to that this could very well be an addition to his gospel. And I mean, like we read, these things are written so you might believe Jesus is the Son of God, that you might have life in his name. End of story. Oh, but then suddenly, after these things, Jesus showed himself again and to the disciples at the Sea of Tiberias, John 21, verse 1. So it's like conclusion, and then, oh, wait, But wait, there's more, like the infomercial. And a lot of modern Bibles provide us with this extended edition of the book of John, and we are given an entire account of the disciples fishing while Yeshua apparently came along to increase their catch. Okay, and after that, they all sat around a little fire and they ate fish together. Okay, and depending on your opinion of the text, whether you believe it's authentic or an addition, there are a few interesting points to consider about the fish in this event. And I will show you, I broke down the Greek, and it really does work if you consider what the Greek could mean for the words fish. And here it says, just as day was breaking, Jesus stood on the shore, yet his disciples did not know that it was Jesus. He said to them, children, do you have any fish? And here's the Greek word, phosphagion, maybe. They said no. He said to them, cast the net on the right side of the boat, and you will find some. So they cast it, and now they were not able to haul it in because of the quantity of fish. Ichthion, very close to ichthus. That disciple whom Jesus loved, therefore said to Peter, it's the Lord. And when Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on his outer garment, for he was stripped for work, and he threw himself into the sea. And the other disciples came in the boat, dragging the net full of fish, ichthion, for they were not far from the land, but about 100 yards off. When they got out on land, they saw a charcoal fire in place with fish. Here's a third word, opserion. It was laid out on it, and bread. And Jesus said unto them, bring some of the fish, opserion, that you have just caught. So Simon Peter went aboard and hauled the net ashore full of large fish, ichthion, 153 of them. And although there were so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said unto them, come and have breakfast. Now none of the disciples dared ask, who are you? They knew it was the Lord. Jesus came and took the bread and gave it to them, and so with the fish, opserion. Why is it using so many different words for fish here? There's 3 different words. This was now the 3rd time that Jesus was revealed to the disciples after he was raised from the dead. Okay, I think there's a reason. If this is an authentic piece of text, I think there is a reason. And in many occasions throughout the text, the word fish does not always refer to a literal fish, and that's what we're dealing with here. It is referring to a condiment that is eaten with bread, and you saw that Jesus mentioned bread. Come have some of this opserion in bread. It is a plant-based relish or spread, and a lot of people believe that it was made from seaweed. And we'll go with that. And if it would make sense why they were looking for seaweed out in the boat. And if you notice the inclusion of the Greek words in the brackets, that all 3 and the differences between those that I pointed out, you can see that we are dealing with a variety of meanings. It's not just a little fish with scales and fins. Okay. And I think they were applied appropriately to fit the idea that they were fishing. They were looking for opserion. Okay, let's look at the first word that it mentions. Phosphagion in verse 5 refers to anything eaten with bread, such as a plant-based condiment or a roasted relish. Ichthion, it used that word a few times. It does refer to a literal fish. Ichthion. Opserion also refers to anything eaten with bread and is associated with plant relish, commonly understood to be made from seaweed. Okay, so one of those words is exclusively in reference to a literal fish. The other 2 are way more flexible and refer to anything eaten with bread. One specifically refers to that plant-based relish. And I think it's very possible that why there's a variety of words in this story, and other stories too. throughout the New Testament where fish is mentioned, it could easily be a reference to this relish or spread. And as often as bread was eaten during that time, a condiment would have been just as common to read about. It's kind of like today, people put butter on their toast, jelly. I mostly put strawberry jelly on my toast. I have a sweet tooth. I really love it. And it's just like that. Like, people are putting these condiments on their bread, okay? And over time, the accounts in the Gospels, they could have developed into literal references to fish. It's most definitely why they ended up as fish in the English language. It's because, not because that's what occurred in the event, but because the text changes in translation. It's just the way it is. And people, like I said, people are willing to admit that the text changes in translation until you start talking about veganism, and all of a sudden nothing is possible when it comes to translation. Just trust whatever text you have. There's no agenda against this. There's only an agenda against everything else you preach about. Okay. But when you're looking at those Greek words, it's interesting that the occurrences where the text refers to the condiment versus the times that it refers to the actual fish. And when Jesus initially asked the disciples if they had any fish, the Greek word was that relish. Do you guys have any relish? He's asking them. And when they sat down to eat, the food that they mentioned was the relish. Okay? But it's only when the disciples were drawing in their nets full of fish that the word ichthion was used. It's like they're looking for relish, and they could not pull it in because their nets were so full of fish. And a lot of people recognize that relish was so common back then that it's seen in other writings like the Iliad. I think this was the same author that pointed that out for that I quoted before. Anyway, if you reread the passages, the passage that I have with those definitions in mind, the story unfolds harmoniously from a vegan perspective. Yeshua asked his friends if they had any relish, and they replied that they did not. He said, "Cast your nets on the other side and you will find some," which he was alluding to seaweed. And when they did, they were not able to pull it in because there were so many fish, actual fish, in their nets. When the disciples got to shore, they saw that Yeshua was roasting some relish over the fire, and together they spread it over the loaves of bread. And it works. It works if you read it that way. And, that's the reason there are so many different Greek words in that story. It complements the idea that their focus was the relish, the seaweed, and but the fish got in the way when they were pulling it in. And that's where a lot of people will be like, "Oh, that's kind of far-fetched for you to go that far to say that's what happened." Well, I'm telling you, the Greek works, number one. And number two, the people who were probably arguing against this, they probably believe, and I'm just saying this, I'm just bringing these people in again, I'm just kind of picking on them now. It's like, is what I just said so ridiculous to consider when there are teachers out there who are teaching that Genesis 1, who teaches a animal sacrifice. I'm sorry. I'm trying to get my thoughts together. It never ceases to amaze me that so many people conclude that animals were created to be eaten by humans, and they believe that Genesis chapter 1 teaches this. Okay? So if some interpretations in this story don't satisfy my viewers or readers, I just have to remind myself what line of reasoning those skeptics have adopted about the creation account, or about a future Messiah, or about our Messiah, who some people are teaching is right now slaughtering animals in heaven. I never understand that. So I just have to remind myself, when you look at the people who are teaching all this stuff, is like something this minimal doesn't seem that strange, guys. Okay. But like I said, my book offers multiple possibilities, and that was just one. Okay. If John chapter 21 is legit, and it was originally a part of the story, that was a perfectly logical explanation for it, an interpretation. But like I said, it's just as possible that that entire chapter wasn't even there. If not, there is a reasonable explanation why Yeshua is depicted to have eaten fish. The story developed over time. If people are going to read it that way, and that's the way people intended it, people who collaborated are the final product of the Bible. Okay, stories evolve over time. It's the game of telephone. So if anything in the text depicts Jesus literally eating fish, then why can't that be a possibility? I think it's a lot more reasonable to consider the Gospels in light of veganism than it is to consider the creation account in light of carnivorism. That's just me. Some people are the opposite. People who are still addicted to flesh and who read their lifestyle, their cultural upbringing into the text. So let's look at one more text before we move on to the next story. There is a record of this same story in the Gospel of the Holy 12. All right, let's look. And I hope some of you have been able to really take in what the Gospel of the Holy 12 is telling us. So, all right, we'll skip down to here the bold face that I have here. It says, they answered him, nay, Lord, not enough for all. There is naught but a small loaf, a little oil, and a few dried fruits. And he said unto them, let these suffice. Come and dine. And he blessed them, and they ate. They were filled. And there was a pitcher of water also, and he blessed it likewise. And lo, it was the fruit of the vine. So this part of the story, it's neat because it tells you what they had. Bread and fruit. Okay? It's as simple as that. It does show them fishing, so, whatever. Maybe they did go back to their former lifestyle, and he's, for the last time, I'm calling you away from this again. I told you I didn't want you to go fishing. But, according to the canonical Gospels, they were out looking for seaweed. So you can conclude from that what you want. These men aren't the Messiah. They're not perfect. I don't know if all of them did. If they did repent from the lust of the flesh, I'd say most of them did. But most of the time, Bible believers, they focus on whatever supports their existing theology. And they've only heard the canon, the New Testament from the canon. Those Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, their entire lives, that's all they've heard. And they've built their reality around those fish stories so much that they can't consider any other account like the Gospel of Holy 12. But if Yeshua was indeed a vegetarian, then we need to explore any alternative analysis. And one of the passages that I initially questioned was the event of, it was where he first appeared after his resurrection. And this one also deals with him supposedly eating fish, all right? So let's look at it. It is in Luke 24, 41 through 44. It says, while they yet believed, not for joy, and wondered, he said unto them, have you here any meat? And this trips a lot of people up thinking he's looking for animal flesh. He's not. That word meat is generic. And they gave him a piece of a broiled fish and a honeycomb. And he took it and he did eat before them. All right. So there it is. Obviously, Jesus was a flesh eater, right? Not so much, guys. In fact, not at all. So depending on your level of faith or your level of skepticism, some of you, that passage can be interpreted a variety of ways. And some biblical vegans who interpret that passage at face value, they do believe that Jesus ate the fish in his resurrected state, but he did so for the reason of proving to his followers that he was the resurrected Messiah and not a ghost. Because Jesus said, for spirits, they don't have flesh and blood or bones, as you see that I have. And so it wasn't because his glorified body needed to eat, per se. It was because, as one guy quotes, he says, with a pedological condescension, he wanted to prove to his disciples that he could eat and was not a mere phantom. And that's only one view. I don't buy it. I do agree that eating in front of his disciples might demonstrate that he was indeed resurrected. He wasn't a ghost, which, it's a whole nother conversation. Did they believe in ghosts? Why would they believe that there are ghosts running around? Anyway, that's suspect right there. It's not consistent to think that Yeshua ate flesh, not in his life on earth or in his resurrected state. This is me talking. And prior to the 2nd century, a lot of you have heard the name Tertullian. He was a variant source writer from that era. He talks about this story and attests that according to the information he had at that time, he didn't have these modern versions of the gospel. Okay. He says that it was after the gall that he tasted the honeycomb. He doesn't mention the fish in his writings. Okay. It wasn't until later centuries they began steering away from the honeycomb. They started talking about the fish within their writings. But before that time, and Tertullian's is probably the earliest that talks about this story, and he says that it's the honeycomb only. Prior to the 4th century, most historians write about the honeycomb, but post 4th century, after that, the honeycomb is missing. So people, they kind of changed it. They added the fish, and then later they took out the honeycomb. So, and I don't know. I had a hard time following Keith Akers when he was talking about the ichthus and how it became a symbol for the Christian faith. And a lot of people wanted to emphasize it more prominently. So I didn't really follow where he was going with that. A lot of people think the fish rendering of Luke 24 that we just read, that it was a poor translation. It should be talking about that plant-based relish. In all fairness, that's not the word that's used, the Greek word, so I personally don't believe that's the case. The Greek isn't in favor of that. Just being honest here. So if we base our conclusion off the text at face value, we can see what happened. If they did offer their Messiah a fish, which they should have known, that's another reason. It's like these apostles, these disciples knew that he did not eat flesh. So that is another reason that you can question the text. It's because he did not eat flesh. Why would they give him fish to eat, knowing that he did not condone that type of behavior? That is a big reason. But if the text is correct, if they gave him a fish, it doesn't mean that he ate it. He could have just as easily eaten the honeycomb and not the fish. It would have been the same way he responded to the fish and the loaves in that other instance where 2 things were given to him and he only took one. Same thing could have easily happened in this scenario. I don't believe the fish was a part of the story, but if you want to believe that, that's fine. How did he respond? He took the honeycomb and he ate the honeycomb. Okay? All right. We're wrapping it up here. I'm glad this video wasn't too long. So like I said, with Keith Akers, a lot of people believe ichthyon or ichthus has more of a symbolic application. It was only understood in the Greek to be an icon for Yeshua's ministry. Somewhere in the mix, any account mentioned that mentioned the ichthus could have easily been rendered in a way to depict Jesus providing or eating it. I can't remember his explanation for that, but I didn't really make heads or tails of it. It was just a symbol. I'll have to revisit his book about that, but maybe he's on to something. In the broad spectrum, guys, the entire purpose for Christ's arrival was to accomplish what the first Adam and the rest of humanity failed to do: live in perfect submission to the design of our Creator. And if Yeshua succumbed to eating flesh, it would have compromised his divine status as the true Messiah. Okay, so when you approach the New Testament, you have to use that fundamental rule for interpreting those instances where flesh eating is assumed. Okay, and that's what I got for this. We have the creation layout, we have the design, we have what God gave to us for food, and we have to believe that the Messiah submitted to that. Okay? We can't do this poor eisegetical approach to the scriptures, jump to Mosaic law, pull it into the creation account, teach that God made animals for us to kill and eat, and then jump forward to the time of Christ and say he submitted to Mosaic law, so he had to kill and eat animals to be that perfect. That's just not the way good hermeneutics and good interpretation is. You sound ridiculous when you teach that kind of stuff. Okay? All right. I think that's all I got. I might go ahead and do the flesh pots concluded. This is about the Passover lamb. Did he eat the Passover lamb? So I know a lot of people have been waiting on that one too. So, all right, like it, subscribe, do what you got to do. Okay. Thanks for watching, guys.